Hi everyone, and welcome to this first event in the You Can Culture The Journey, where the theme today is to get humble. My name is Andreas Almlöv, and I'm a healthy culture advocate here at Heart Management and a colleague to Tobias that you're going to meet in a little while. So happy to have you all here and really looking forward to this conversation that we're going to dive into today. But at Heart Management, our vision is a world free from destructive workplace culture. And we have a mission to empower leaders globally to cultivate cultures that drive mission success, employee thriving, and ethical impact. Yeah, so why are we actually here today? Of course, we're here and we're very honored to be joined by Klaus Moosmayer and Richard Bistrong. So super glad to have you guys with us, and they're going to be in a conversation together with Tobias in a little while. But I do believe there is a deeper reason why we are here today as well. With us today is an exceptional group of leaders, ethics and compliance professionals and HR specialists representing numerous companies, industries, and countries. And I think we all share a desire to build successful companies that can earn and sustain a high level of trust from employees, clients, investors, and regulators. And research shows that trust depends not only on our companies being competent in delivering great products and services, but also on being seen as ethical. A trust study by Harvard Law School Forum on corporate governance showed that while 95% of executives believe that building trust improves the bottom line, only 27% of customers and 65% of employees highly trust their company. Half of them reported experienced trust damaging events, then many ended their relationship with the company as a result. And while a robust formal compliance program is essential to maintaining trust, it's the informal side, culture, human behavior, and leadership practices that ultimately determines its effectiveness. Both the Department of Justice and the OECD highlights this in their guidelines for effective compliance programs. Additionally, an extensive MIT study found that bad culture is the main reason why employees leave companies. Culture is at the heart of our company's ability to deliver on its mission, achieve strategic goals, build a thriving workplace, and have an ethical impact. Yet many find culture complex and difficult to understand, and 85% of culture transformation initiatives fail. And I think that's why we're here, to have practical conversations about how to cultivate thriving cultures through transformative leadership habits. As Rob Chestnut, a former chief ethics officer at Airbnb, said about Tobias' book, You Can Culture, everybody talks about culture, but there's very little good practical literature on exactly how to do it. If you're a leader, you must culture, and this book is a great guide for your journey. And now I'm going to hand it over to Tobias to introduce the habit that we focus on today, getting humble. But before I go, I just want to let you know that in the end of this session, after this session, actually, you'll receive access to a presentation highlighting key learnings on cultivating thriving cultures of integrity with practical examples from large multinational companies. And I'll say a few words about that at the end. But now I'll hand it over to you, Tobias. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Andreas, and I'm so incredibly excited to see you all here today for this conversation. And in a few minutes, I'm gonna open the conversation with Klaus and Richard. But I wanted to give a bit of an introduction to why do we talk about this habit of getting humble. And I think for some of you, you have already read a bit in my book, You Can Culture, and you have some understanding or some introduction. And of course, for those of you who haven't, our perspective, what we found in working with so many organizations and having conversations with researchers around the world, is that when it comes to cultivating a healthy culture, it's not something we do through those short-term projects. And I think, as Andreas said, that 85% of them fail. It comes through changing the signals of what is encouraged, rewarded, or not accepted within an organization. And those signals are shaped by our habits, and especially by leadership habits across an organization. I think it's very important, and I wrote something on that on LinkedIn very recently, that it's so easy to only focus on tone from the top. And of course, tone from the top matters immensely, but so does the signals that are sent from all different levels of an organization. So we identified 4 habits. The first habit is to get humble. And I just thought about, as we made this invitation to this event, I mean, if we would have sent out instead how to create a high-performing organization or whatever, maybe that would sound a bit more attractive than an event with the topic, get humble. But I want to share a little bit of why that is so incredibly important, and why that is the first habit and the fundamental habit for anything else to make sense. In the process of writing You Can Culture, my original Texas-based publisher collapsed in the span of just a few weeks. There were several hundreds of employees, and they had been celebrated as the best place to work, and their CEO had even been hailed as this champion of modern leadership. And they made these bold claims on their website that these are our values, and and they permeate all behaviors and all decisions in our company. And then they collapsed. And it became really clear in the aftermath that there hadn't been any real accountability for leadership, no ability to speak up to senior leadership, no transparency about key aspects of their business. And ultimately, the company lost their clients' trust and went bankrupt. You know, there are so many companies, and I'm sure we've seen that, seen examples of that ourselves, that, you know, make these grand statements on their website. Like, I'm just taking one example. I'm not after picking on them, but we make this claim that these are our values, these are our behaviors that permeate all and guide all decisions at our company, or we have zero tolerance for corruption in this company. But I think we also all understand that no company and no leader will consistently in every situation live up to our values. We are all vulnerable. In the introduction to this habit in my book, I share another story that talks about an organization that I visited in the US that had gone through this very, very public, highly publicized scandal that was on the New York Times and really in news around the world. And the new leadership had put in the unenviable place of trying to rectify the situation, trying to restore trust. And it was so clear that there had been these, red flags, that there had been credible people that had raised concerns, but they hadn't been listened to. Instead, they tried to silence them, they tried to badmouth them, and so on. And as I met that leadership team, I told them that, of course, you're going to need to implement structures and formal processes and so on to ensure that this same thing, this leadership misconduct, which was sexual in nature, doesn't happen again. But what I think is just as important is to reflect on, why did we act like we did? Why didn't we listen? Why did we treat this situation as a PR problem instead of looking at the underlying issues? Why did it have to cost us so incredibly much before we actually took action? There's this illusion, and I talk about that in the book, that we are the good company with a healthy culture and noble values, something that I call the health illusion. And it's incredibly dangerous, both on an organizational and a personal level, We become blind to signs that we're veering off track. We treat concerns like PR problems and attempt to fix issues by making bold statements or publishing new values instead of addressing root causes. People won't admit their challenges and won't ask for help even when they need it. And we look for scapegoats instead of taking responsibility. So this really leads us to the need to get humble. The organizational psychologist Adam Grant defines humility like this, that humility is often misunderstood. It's not a matter of having low self-confidence. One of the Latin roots of the word humility means from the earth. It's about being grounded, recognizing that we're flawed and fallible. And if you just reflect for a second, do you think that that is a mindset that really permeates your organization and your leaders? Humility is considered the #1 virtue in several philosophical and religious traditions. And Professor Edgar Schein, for example, who is seen as the modern father of culture, or the father of modern culture research, wrote extensively on humility, including 2 books called Humble Leadership and Humble Inquiry. And in my experience, what really made me really understand the power of getting humble was working with an organization quite many years ago now that had gone through, again, this big scandal that had really uncovered some really toxic elements in their culture and just some, lack of checks and balances and a lot of things around leadership misconduct. And what was so special about this process is that the leadership were willing to, instead of seeking scapegoats, they were willing to assess their culture, identify their blind spots, and uncover how they had drifted from their values. This was an incredibly challenging process. I'm not going to say anything else as I worked with this leadership team to really dig deep into what was it that led to the place where we found ourselves. How could we veer off course from our values in such a significant way? How did we end up with these elements of toxicity in our culture? And we started to put words on that. And then ultimately, they were willing to publicly go in front of their organization and say, and apologize and take ownership and responsibility for what had become of the organization. And of course, there was a lot of things that needed to be done to really drive a cultural transformation. There was governance models that needed to be changed. There were checks and balances that needed to be put in place. There were whistleblower systems that needed to be put in place, and all of that. But it's all the cultural change that really was tremendous, and I talk about it in the book, started with getting humble. And I've come to see humility not just as this virtue that we think about, oh, that's a humble person, but really as a lived practice, something that we must consciously over and over again practice. And in You Can Culture, I outline 3 core practices for cultivating humility. And these are the ones that we're going to be having kind of as a foundation for our conversation here today, to embrace vulnerability, which really means that we don't just assume that our culture is healthy, our leadership values driven, or our employees consistently ethical. Instead, we recognize our fallibility and we accept that we will occasionally veer off course. And when I say accept, it doesn't mean that we think it's okay. No, I talk about that in the book, about dealing with unhelpful and destructive behavior. What I mean with that is to say that we understand that that is the reality that we're operating in. And because of that, we foster a culture where we talk about the dilemmas that we face, where we talk about our blind spots, where we talk about, we don't assume that everyone is going to do this perfectly. Instead, we assume that people at every level in the organization is vulnerable. And I just want to say here that I think that the kind of proliferation in the last years of employee branding and consultants, and I'm one of them, and I worked in communication before, so I'm sure I'm part of the problem there. But I think that proliferation of ways of making our sustainability reporting and all these things, the ways that we try to make ourselves look so great to the outside world, but where we don't really take the time to look at what is the reality and operate from that reality, that has really done us a big disservice. The second thing is that we take ownership. Understanding our imperfections means resisting the urge to deflect blame or seek scapegoats when things go wrong. And I'm sure that you've seen that if you've studied corporate scandals, or perhaps you've experienced one in your company, or whether on a small scale or a large scale. But it's so easy to only focus on how to avoid liability. And of course, that is an incredibly important question. But I'm going to point that out a little bit later, that actually looking at how do we rebuild trust will actually force us to think differently, to take ownership. And we want to create a culture in our organization, and I'm sure that everyone listening to this conversation does, where people, instead of first thinking about how something, if they see an issue in their culture or something going wrong in their team, instead of thinking why it's everyone else's fault, that they instead start with thinking about what is my responsibility? How could my leadership have contributed to these elements of unhealthy in our culture, whatever that might be? And how could I, by changing my behavior, contribute to a change? And if we can instill that type of mindset in our organization, we have such a power to drive really, really powerful change in our organizations. And the third thing is rebuilding broken trust. I love this TED talk from a social psychologist named Becky Kennedy, who talks about parenting. And her parenting is about the number one parenting strategy. And she says that the number one parenting strategy is to get good at repair. Because that every parent will mess up, and I for sure do, and create disconnection with their child. We must become experts at taking ownership and mending broken trust. And the same is true for every leader and every organization. Assuming that we will mess up, we also then need to learn how to take ownership and apologize and actually communicate around that, whether it's a small thing like, oh, I forgot to invite someone to a meeting, which can create this breach of trust, or it's the bigger thing where we fail to live up to our values as a company. How we respond in those moments matters the most. When leaders aren't willing to get humble, we get lots of different problems. And the thing is that I think all the other, or the other three leadership habits here become powerless, because we can talk all we want about creating a speak up culture. But if the leaders in our organization don't see that they actually need to hear the concerns, need to listen, they aren't going to be listening. So that humility, that getting humble, sits as the foundation for everything else. And I want to just take some examples of some research that supports this. I read this study recently in Harvard Business Review about why companies should disclose their lack of progress on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what they found in their study was that when companies disclose personal or organizational vulnerabilities like unfavorable diversity numbers, they are viewed more positively than companies that stay silent. Transparency signals genuine commitment and builds trust. And they write this, and I thought this was great to read. They write that we know from decades of research that when people disclose personal information, they are more apt to be liked and trusted. One reason for this is that when we disclose sensitive information that exposes our vulnerabilities, we communicate something more profound than the content of the information itself, that we're willing to be genuine even if it means taking a risk. In the case of lagging diversity numbers, the act of transparency signals something beyond the particulars of numerical representation. It signals that the organization is genuinely committed to the goal of advancing diversity because they're willing to be honest about their current standing, even if it's risky to do so. I just thought this was fantastic because I think that's exactly how it works. And trust researcher Professor Sandra Sucher at Harvard, who I've interviewed extensively for the book, found that while leaders often fear apologizing, believing it will be used against them, apologies actually improve public perception and trust. So if we think that trust, or if we realize and acknowledge that trust is business critical for our company, we have to understand that getting humble is really fundamental to that. So I want to leave you with just some thoughts or questions that I think are interesting to ponder here before we jump into the conversation, and I invite Klaus and Richard onto the stage here. But perhaps our drive to only communicate how great and ethical our company is might actually be harming us. And perhaps confidence and humility aren't in conflict, but arrogance and humility are. And perhaps cultivating a thriving and ethical culture isn't rocket science, but it requires integrating practices that involve interpersonal risk and that challenge our comfort zone. And I'm sure that you might still have reservations about this habit, about getting humble. You may be thinking that, I mean, this sounds good in theory, but you haven't met our leadership team. You don't know our company, or how can this work in the pressure of everyday business? And that's why I felt it was so fantastic as we start this journey of the You Can culture journey, and start here with humility, that we have two people with us today that I think are people who are really in the midst and have experienced the pressures of business, who are not just thinking about this from some naive perspective, but who have really thought about this in the settings of corporations that they are working at or have been working at. And of course, we have Richard Bistrong with us, and I'm sure that many of you here know something about his story of going from being the vice president of international sales in a large company, traveling the world in sales, and then ending up becoming part of corrupt practices and ultimately ending up in prison, and today really working with organizations around the world to help them really integrate better practices to stay on the right side of the law, but also to operate with ethics. And we also have Klaus Moosmayer with us, who I also think needs no presentation, but he's the he is the executive vice president of ethics, risk, and compliance at Novartis, the large global pharma company. And Klaus and I, we've had a few conversations together, and I've really appreciated his humility, and also looking at not wanting to say that. And I'll just take this example because I was actually listening to him some months ago in Geneva at this panel conversation where the interviewer were asking different leaders of ethics and compliance in different companies whether ethics was something that was a part of their DNA as a company. And one after another, people said, yes, it is. And I was sitting there thinking, no, that's bullshit. But then it came to Klaus, and he said, no, I think we need to be a bit humble about this. And that's why also I thought that he would be such a fantastic person to have with us in this conversation. So without further ado, let's invite Klaus Moosmayer and Richard Bistrong into the conversation. And I'll stop sharing this presentation.
And while they enter, I just want to tell all the participants something that I forgot to say in the beginning, and that it is that we will, of course, have some time for questions and answers in the end for all three of these prestigious gentlemen. So if you have questions you want to ask, please write them in the chat, or I'm going to invite you into the conversation at the end. So take it away, Tobias.
That's not a great thing to say on the topic of humility, these prestigious gentlemen. So Klaus and Richard, it's so great to have you here. And in my book, UK culture, I describe humility not just as a virtue, but as a habit. And I just wanted to start by asking both of you, what is your relationship with the idea of getting humble? Why do you think, or don't you think, which would be very interesting, that it matters?
Richard, go first.
Oh, Klaus. Well, first of all, Tobias, thank you for the invitation to join you on talking about a very sensitive subject, humility, and to everyone who's joining us. And it's always a pleasure to see Klaus again. So I'm very excited about this discussion. You know, one of the things you talk about in the book, Tobias, are rituals. Okay. And one of my rituals is I have a morning meditation that comes into my email box. And if there are no coincidences, today's was be honest in small things and in all things. And it concludes with guard your thoughts, they become your deeds. Guard your deeds, they form your character. Guard your character, it decides your destiny. And humility, I was thinking, is a thought, right? That's where it starts. And to me, the poles that exist are humility and narcissism, okay? And I've lived on the narcissism side, and I appreciate that when we're humble personally and we project humility, that we're keeping ourselves away from this what's in it for me, me, and me mentality. And we can talk about what that means practically for individuals, for leaders, for all of us. But I think that one thing that I either heard Klaus write or say, which I think captures it, especially in a volatile commercial environment, is Klaus once said, you know, acknowledge success. Don't over celebrate it. And I think that that is the perfect, it would be an equally impressive definition of humility, is that we can enjoy commercial success. We can enjoy doing well at our jobs, but what do we do with that success? And does that success lead us to think, well, now I can even do more? And then all of a sudden we have this success addiction. So maybe we can, you know, for me personally, and I've also had some recent challenges on this, is if we stay humble, we keep away from that narcissism, and it's not about my organization, it's all about me. So those are some initial thoughts.
Thank you, Richard. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, congratulations, Richard, always at your outfit. I'm always absolutely smashed by your outfit. So I need to be very humble on this, right? So Andreas, Tobias, thank you very much for inviting us to this most relevant discussion. Not an easy one, to be honest, not an easy one.
Yeah.
To get humble for companies and people in companies, it is often a very tough experience, because it's by experience in many ways. We want to have an honest conversation here, right? So I mean, in the corporate world, the context matters, of course, and the context often asks for overconfidence. Look, if I take a company like Novartis now, and I was before 18 years at Siemens, so I had the honor to be in 2 major turnarounds in 2 different industries. But these companies are here for hundreds of years and have, I mean, a horizon of planning over decades if you produce and research, develop new medicines. But we are measured also for good transparency reasons on a quarterly basis. But oh Lord, if you miss 1 quarter of results, you're getting smashed. I mean, you're getting, really bashed by the investors, by the journalists, by everyone. So what I want to say is the corporations, the companies have this inherent risk to always demonstrate overconfidence, to show the nice PowerPoint slides at the conferences, not to show weaknesses. And this is what you said, Tobias. You are in a company to say we are wonderful, we are great, we have best numbers and feedback, and suddenly big bam, and there's the big scandal and everything falls together. And therefore, Tobias, and thank you for reminding me, I would say this statement, culture is part of our DNA, or zero corruption is part of our DNA, or ethics is part of our DNA. This is this overconfidence. This is this wishful thinking. But also let me protect a little bit the corporations, because I mean, it's so difficult to show a vulnerability, one of your themes, on open stage. And Richard knows this from his many conferences and interactions he's doing. I mean, there are, Richard, not so many companies maybe are willing to show this vulnerability and sharing this with you openly. Maybe in the Chatham House rules in the back room, because if you show as a company vulnerability on a stage, the people say, oh, there's a problem, they have issues, maybe not so shiny, and should we invest in them? And so it's really tough for corporations to be humble and to show vulnerabilities. And I leave it here not to talk too much, that there's really a tension, a certain dilemma in the corporate world.
And I think that, thank you, Klaus, and I think that demonstrates the linkage between humility and vulnerability, right? Something that I'll never forget is one of my clients, very often at a compliance internal event, the CEO will start off with very often it's an aspirational speech, right? We do the right thing, we have great values. Tobias, it's what you talked about at the beginning. And I mean, this must have been 5 years ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday. He talked about how he was bullied as a child, and that this experience of being bullied as a child informed how serious he takes ethics and compliance and good conduct as an adult. And for the CEO to show that kind of vulnerability, I think sends that message that if the CEO is willing to share that part of his life, you know, we also can do the same here without being fearful. So that practically had a big impression on me. I saw one compliance leader leading a session, and she admitted that she made a compliance mistake in a process. And she said, I broke my own rule, and I went ahead and here's what I did to correct it. So again, showing that vulnerability of we all make mistakes makes us feel, I think, safer about admitting our own vulnerabilities and our own fallibility, and can help keep us humble.
Yeah, and I think this is so great in these examples that you're giving, Richard. And I'm thinking about this, that in one way you could say that if we don't get humble, there's a big chance we might get humbled. That's it. And maybe a lot of companies only get humble when they got humbled because of something happened that led to a scandal and so on, and then suddenly you had to rethink your practices. But I wanted to hear from both of your perspectives, because if we, for example, take from your perspective and your story and example, Richard, and I from conversations that you and I have had, I mean, I've heard you share about these, you know, the pressure between or the tension between the pressure to succeed and the pressure to comply and the pressure to stay on the kind of ethical path. And of course, that's something that people across our organizations, and I know that we have lots of ethics and compliance professionals and leaders in this call. We have lots of other people as well, but many who represent that. And so of course, we know that many of our people are experiencing these tensions out around the world. And at the same time, I've also talked to so many ethics and compliance professionals who would say, but if they would only come to me and talk about their dilemmas, but people don't dare. It's not something that is, like, you know, part of the culture. It's not something that we talk about. And to ask you, Richard, what do you think that what could companies do to support people like you are in that situation, and like so many thousands of or hundreds of thousands of people are around the world, to support them to feel that they can actually, that it's not taken for granted that they're gonna, you know, navigate all this by themselves, but that they're actually fallible and that they will be tempted to do the wrong thing, and then actually be able to talk about the challenges?
Well, I think the first thing is to acknowledge it, right? Is to say, look, there will come times where you think you're in the middle of competing corporate objectives, right? And Klaus and I have talked about this. Companies are in business to show financial performance, right? They have shareholders, they have stakeholders. There will come time when your values get challenged. That is a part of corporate life. And you might think that we're talking on two different voices, the voice of business and the voice of compliance. But we don't mean to. So when you feel like you're in the middle of competing corporate objectives and thinking, what does the company really want? Respect for the code of conduct or these aggressive forecasts? Don't decide on yourself, right? Come to us. So I think part of it is habituating and normalizing that as a human being in a corporate culture, whether it's procurement or sales, that this might actually happen. You're giving someone the runway and the pathway to come to you when they do feel that tension. And I share that as an individual. Klaus, I'm fascinated to hear how do you do that as a corporation where you have people all over the world facing such financial pressure?
I think this giving the people a voice and a room is super important. And this is often misunderstood. I think all companies are doing kind of surveys. I mean, you find this everywhere, pulse checks about ethical culture, surveys. But then there is often no action afterwards, and that's super dangerous, by the way. If you offer something, I listen to you, but then nothing happens afterwards. And I would bet this is in most of the cases no visibility that after speaking up, the listeners are really acting. I believe there's no survey fatigue in corporations. There is a fatigue of non-action after an ethics survey. I give you one practical example. When we did one of our first global ethics surveys, it was a very unpleasant feedback in one area, that there's deep in the company still the fear of retaliation, the fear of retaliation. And if you just leave it as it is, nothing will change. So you need then to do the hard work, go local, do the roundtables, be humble, listen. What is the issue in the local context? Maybe different in the one country from the other country. So this is really, really hard work. And again, the one thing is the nice thing to say, we're doing global surveys and pulse checks. The other thing is, what are you doing to address the often unpleasant, very unpleasant for a corporate leader messages which come out of your organization? And it all takes time. Maybe the last word is, because scandals in companies are big opportunities for a cultural change and also have their risks, you know.
Sure.
I always have to smile when, you know, half a year after the scandal broke out, the leaders say, now we are a different company. Yes, it's the past. We are now, you hear this, right, Richard? You hear this? Now we are a different company. This was last year, but today we have a different culture. Nonsense. I mean, this is hard work, Richard, right? Not a half a year of a new slogan.
No, and sorry,
No, I was just
go on,
gonna
Richard.
I could pivot on everything that Klaus says because it's so interesting and relevant and resonating. But I read an article about, I think it was in the MIT Sloan Journal, that people are getting fatigued by these surveys. And the reason why they're getting fatigued by these surveys is because they don't think the company's doing anything with it.
Sure.
So they are disengaging. And one of the solutions that the authors said was called the 1, 2, 3 solution. Take one of the most difficult findings from the survey and work with a group to come up with 2 possible solutions to this problem, and follow up at least 3 times with the group about what's being done about it. So I love this 1, 2, 3 rule from surveys.
Really, really helpful. Super helpful. And I'm thinking, Klaus, I mean, you are a part of an executive team, and you've also, I mean, you worked at Siemens, now at Novartis, and we also know that the pharma industry has gone through its challenges in terms of being seen as trusted, and I'm thinking that arrogance, if we would say that arrogance is the opposite of humility, and of course you mentioned narcissism as well, but if we think about that arrogance, and I think about a conversation I had with Hiltrud Werner, who came in as part of the management board at Volkswagen after the scandal, and she told me on our podcast that like that the mindset at the company at the time was like, we are the benchmark. Why should we listen to the outside world? And there wasn't this culture of listening and speaking up and so on. And so if we think about how costly this arrogance is, and then Jim Collins in his book on Why the Mighty Fall, that's what he puts at the first kind of step is that arrogance. And what do you think, I mean, from your vantage point and your position, Klaus, can be done to avoid that type of arrogance, and to foster humility, and to avoid the cost of that arrogance?
Yeah, I would say we have to a little bit change our way of thinking about the purpose of a corporation. Everyone brings the purpose, rightfully so, in the front, but the purpose is often, if you listen how these purpose statements are, a little bit in this arrogance corner, I would say. And if we could have a discussion, it's difficult to say we have a purpose, but we also need to acknowledge the shortcomings, the failures, the dilemmas. I mean, in the pharma industry, it's a prime example. Was always seen as a very arrogant industry. Why? Because the purpose per se is fantastic. I think, therefore, I always say you can always criticize that, but I mean, the purpose to extend people's lives by medicine, compared to other industries, is a prime purpose. But this somehow converted to an arrogance, which was not seeing anymore the dilemmas we have in this industry, from early research over development, how we manufacture, how we sell, how we interact, for profit on health. So I think we need to, also in the executive teams and the boards, to see this purpose discussion. Is this now also linked to a humble recognition what responsibility, accountability, ethical dilemmas are coming with? And this is normally not taking place today, I would say. Therefore, this too big to fail topic comes into play. We are so important, the purpose, and I think there we have not overcome, I believe, in industry, the situation.
I'm thinking about how to, make this a practice. I was talking to the head of ethics and compliance at Skanska the other day, and she shared this example of, in terms of safety culture, something they do because they had a lot of issues with or not, but they had more significant issues with people dying in workplace accidents. And of course, this is a big, large construction company. And she was sharing that they created this kind of like that whenever a significant accident happens somewhere around the world, they stop work across the world, and they stop in silence. And it is a way to get the whole organization to focus on safety and on the importance of safety. And something I'm reflecting on, and Richard, would you want to start there to think about what are ways that companies, by kind of acknowledging, and I think it's, of course, it's both true in terms of companies and leaders personally, acknowledging past failures, both organizational and personally, while ensuring those lessons are not forgotten. I mean, how can we make that into something that actually helps us as we're moving forward to stay humble?
It's interesting. It brings up so many different thoughts, and I'll just speak to the personal side. And this is something I haven't shared, but it snuck up on me without me thinking about it, is I went from narcissism to humility. And, you know, when you're sitting in a federal prison for 14 and a half months in a cube, you have plenty of time to think about what got you there, right? And the humility that comes with that. And over time, and you know, we've worked together. You know, what I do is very exciting. It's interesting. I get to go all over the world and work with different companies from different organizations. And I started to realize I was moving away from that humility in what Heltred Werner calls shock to shame to change, and to realize that the shame part of it, that doesn't go away. Like you mentioned The Power of Regret by Daniel Pink, which had a huge impact on me. And, you know, now, like, I start my presentations and my workshops with a reminder of how much I regret my decisions. And like, I show these are cards that my children wrote to me when I was in prison. This is a Father's Day card. It's a birthday card. And to say, look, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for giving me a second chance. But I don't, in a way, I wish I was doing anything else but being here, because I regret the decisions that I made each and every day, and they were avoidable. So, you know, my ritual, and Klaus had his team, I think it was Brett Hudson and some of the lawyers that were involved in his DPA. They wrote this wonderful article about going through the DPA process. And in that article was also that humility. It wasn't, well, we're through the DPA, we're the new Novartis now, okay? It was, we always keep our eye on the ball here. This is not something that we put completely in the rearview mirror and we forget about. So I think that when we have that shame part of this shock to shame to change, that we shouldn't totally forget about what got us there, and to always embrace some part of that humility and not to let it go. And that's speaking very personally.
If I may interject here, I fully support this. I believe these personal examples, but they need a stage in the companies, which is not always there, Richard. Because corporate memory is shockingly short, shockingly short. Therefore, I said a scandal is a huge opportunity to drive change, but also has its risks, because you know this, Tobias and Richard. I mean, if you look at companies who went through a scandal, the compliance fatigue came in after a couple of years. It was bureaucracy, then they moved back, they cut the budgets. So the personal example, this is what at the end brings people to reflect and to think. I think there I'm fully in this, but it's not easy in companies. And I repeat this, corporate memory is shockingly short in our organization. So people absolutely make the difference.
So with that in mind, and I think you are so that is so true. And I think about it. There's this kind of story of someone, you know, going looking at themselves in the mirror and then walking away and forgetting what they look like. And I feel that that's often what organizations do when they assess their culture or something like that. We very easily want to forget that, and then we again hold on to whatever statements we want to portray. And I think what then again, my message is, because I think we're all sitting here in this meeting, we understand, I mean, that the companies that we work for, of course, I mean, they should deliver great returns to their shareholders and like all these things. So we're not talking about some naive, fluffy idea, but saying that this is actually fundamental to avoiding a lot of the risks and the things that companies can find themselves ending up in. And just even if we don't go that far, even just getting good ideas on the table, getting, I mean, having good quality on our products, because and so on. But if I could ask you both, and maybe starting with you, Klaus, what do you see as kind of practices that you still think, whether on you take it to whatever level you want to, that leaders and companies can implement to cultivate that humility? What are things that you have found are helpful? And it might be personal to you, but
Yeah, I think we can structure it in two layers because it is also a very operational side of things. To be honest and humble, to maintain over time an honest, open culture in companies also needs investment. This is not coming by free. You need the right structure, the right people. I mean, this is my big topic, you know, this integrated assurance. I mean, if you see a problem in safety, you normally have problems in the human rights side of in the anti-bribery side of things as well. If you have a quality issue, there's maybe a bigger cultural topic in the company. And what companies normally do quite well, they focus on the one issue, they solve it, and they move on, right? Don't look left or right. You have to look left and right if there is a topic. Normally it spreads like cancer. It's normally like cancer. And this most companies don't want to see this. And then I come to a controversial point, but it's also
bring it on.
The relationship between the legal department and the ethics or compliance and risk departments. I mean, as long as compliance is the little sister, brother of legal, and it's difficult to raise the voice. Legal has a super important role to protect the company and to shield the company, but you need also people at company who say, I want to look left and right, I want to see the full picture, and I want to have a holistic integrated assurance system to keep the company on track. This is also, I mean, in all humility, you will not cover everything, but at least you see more. It's also investment. And then the second layer, of course, if there is no real, I mean, intrinsic willingness by the board, the executive committee, the CEO, forget it. I mean, if this is, but you know this, if this is just a talk and there's no support for the real change and the drive, then anyway, it's from the very beginning not the journey set up for success.
Yeah, amazing, and thank you to both of you. And I think we actually want to jump out into questions. I see that the questions are coming in here, and I really want to make sure that we give people time to ask. And I want to say something before we do that, and that is just that I think that when we think about this humility, getting humbled, that it is this constant practice. And of course, I like you, Richard, I also share a story of how I ended up complicit in psychological abuse in the beginning of the book, and it's something I often share. But you know, still I find myself, you know, consistently having to work on this, and I was very grateful for you pointing that out as well, Richard. And after the questions, we're gonna just look at some of the reflection questions from the book that I would really challenge you to put in place as well and to talk about with leaders in your teams and so on, to make this really practical and to challenge yourself. But now, Andreas, I'm giving it over to you and for questions, and please keep on writing questions in the chat.
Yes, thank you so much. Such an interesting conversation to listen to. Thank you, all of you, for this. But we have some question that is coming in the chat now, and hopefully the people would like to be unmuted and jump into the conversation and ask them to you. So I'm going to start with Nakili Kuri. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. Would you like to come in and ask your questions? You're muted, so now I think
Yes,
you're
I
on.
unmuted myself.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for this opportunity. Really a pleasure to listen to all of you. I'm a big fan of, first of all, being a human in the corporate, right? And I think humility is part of being human. And my question relates to that. Did you notice or feel in some cases that being humble could also be understood as a sign of weakness, especially if you are a senior leader? And how did you navigate, especially through time of crisis, from one side being humble, but also to be a leader with authority that people will follow, etc.?
Thank you for a great question. Who wants to start?
Look, I found the most inspiring moments in my career when I heard leaders saying, often in an intimate setting, I made a mistake. I was desperate. I didn't know what to do, and this is the way how I tried to find out of this way. It's normally, to be honest, not happening on the public stage for all the reasons we know. As at the beginning, it's difficult for corporations to show vulnerability in the public space, but this happens sometimes in corporations, and there are good and bad examples which mark you for your life. My first leadership course I did as a young guy in a company, the member of the executive committee back then said, always remember, company first, family second. Then you know where you are. I mean,
Yeah.
you know. But if then years afterwards, a leader really sharing in an open discussion personal problems, issues, we try to open every leadership discussion with 10 minutes to go around the table to people share something personal. How you're feeling today? Is there anything which we should know before we go into budget and headcount, and just to make it open? And I'm surprised, not always, but sometimes, how this changes the conversation to the better, I must say.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's a great question. And here, tone at the top can be so powerful. And there's something called servant leadership, which I'm a big fan of, which is when leaders are here to say, not this is what you need to do for me, but what can we do to better support you? And when you see leaders, sharing that, look, I don't have all the answers, but what I do know is the only problem my company can't help me with is the one I keep to myself, right? These are powerful statements. But and I can put this in the chat, I think where we can go off course is at the middle level of the organization. And we've been using this word culture a lot today. And there was a wonderful article in the MIT Sloan Journal called Building Culture from the Middle Out. Because we have the big C culture, and right, Klaus, that's coming from Basel. But who's responsible for taking that culture and making sure that it makes sense in Indonesia? Right? Your country managers, your managing directors, they control the small C. And they are the ones that are there that can enrich and empower those local teams so that big C makes sense in a small C community. So I think that when we look, this article had a profound impact on me, and it was just a great compliment to your book, Tobias, is that we have to look at culture as just, it's impossible to have a global culture if we're globally dispersed.
Sure.
And to think about who's making sure that small C makes sense, and to keep humility in Indonesia just as strong as it might be in Basel, for example. And I think that's where a lot of companies, and if you look at enforcement actions, that's where it can go wrong.
And to add to what you're saying there, I think that, I mean, when it comes to this topic, modeling it, I mean, leading by example, I think is incredibly important and incredibly powerful. And as you say, Richard, that is something, yes, it happens from the top, but it needs to happen from every level. And I think it's really powerful when someone who is in authority, I mean, who people respect as someone having authority, showing vulnerability, that is something that really can open up an immense sense of trust. And I think maybe what we need to do is to actually, show the data that shows that is actually better, that it's not going to lessen your authority, but that is actually going to build more trust in you, because people shockingly know that you don't have everything in place anyway. It's not a surprise to them. And so I think that's why it's so important.
Thank you, and thank you for your question. Hope you're satisfied with the answers that you got. Let's invite Sarah Cole. Would you like to come in and ask your question?
Can you see me, gents? Lovely to see you all. I knew it'd be a great conversation. I very much enjoyed it. I think one of the things that Klaus called out was the extreme tension that vulnerability can present, particularly for senior management. So I wondered, how do you encourage your board to adopt that style of leadership? I think I read somewhere that although 86% of people believe that there should be this sort of moral leadership, and I think that incorporates vulnerability, only 16% actually thought that it was employed in their own organizations. And I think if that sort of tone in the middle is to be addressed, then we all accept tone in the top needs to be there, but how do we actually bring that to life, if you like, for the board?
I can go first, and then Richard, with his rich experience, can his perspective. It's a very personal thing, to say the executive committee or the board, whatever legal system you're working, has to show up this way or that way. Sounds like staging, right? Like setting things up. Many companies do this, and we have examples. Didn't work out well. I believe at the end it depends on the personal commitment and visibility of these leaders, how they transport this into the daily life. And that's a challenge, because many of us, and I include myself, are not brought up this way. I was brought up in a time as a leader where I said company first, family second. I remember this in one risk workshop many years ago. The CFO said, only report a risk if you have a solution, if not, be silent. This is the world we are coming from. And to change this and say, I want to hear the risks. And as a leader, I may for sure not have the answer for the risk, but we have a better discussion if we have more brains on the table to discuss how we can mitigate risk. And Patrick Wegener put a very nice story in the chat where the answer is not easy. But if you look at Patrick's question, just imagine there's no maybe rule book where you can answer it, but just I believe it's better to have a spirit in the company where you said, let's bring the right brains together, sit together, discuss it openly, pros and cons, come to a joint view, than just saying, yeah, I don't want to hear this. If you have a problem, bring me the solution. If not, shut up. So it's a very personal engagement of the leaders. And it's tough, because we are not, the leaders who are now in charge, who are in the 50s and 60s of their lives, so me included, were not brought up this way, to be honest. This was, I don't know, Richard, how you see it?
Yeah, I think from the board level, it's very much a challenge, right? To get them engaged on this issue. They're looking at more external stakeholders. They're looking high level remuneration. They're looking at forecasts. They're looking at big pictures. And, and my own experience, Klaus, is when I am invited, with the one exception of last week, to run a board sensitivity and awareness, training session, it might be 30 minutes. And that was a lot. Last week in Brazil, it was almost 2 hours, unheard of to have that kind of time with a senior board. So that was a great sign, but it's one thing to try to get the C-suite involved. And Klaus, I think that's what you've done with your integrated approach. You are part of that discussion. For most companies, that's not the case. But Sarah, to get it up to the board level, it's they have a lot on their agenda and also tend to view risk in a very siloed manner.
And I mean, just as an
Great
encouragement,
question.
Sarah, because I'm thinking about an example where this was actually done, and with a multinational company that we worked with, where we're having these conversations about dilemmas and tensions really across the organization, and the CEO really stepped out and really talked very openly about the tensions they were experiencing, actually publicly, and how the impact that has had, and actually where they even took these conversations to the board, and then someone asked the board, so what is our responsibility, or someone in the board asked the others, what is our responsibility in these tensions that have perhaps driven us or driven people to make unethical decisions and so on, and so just as an encouragement that it I guess it can be done, but as you both say, I guess I also believe it's very, very difficult.
Some great perspectives. Thank you very much.
It's a great question, Sarah. Just don't know that it's quite solvable right now.
Evie is raising her hand. Would you like to come in and ask your question?
Hi, everyone. Tobias and Andreas, thank you for such a great and valuable session. And Richard and Klaus, thank you for your insight. My question piggybacks off the previous question a little bit. This is a great content, but I can imagine not every leader, not every manager that you approach with this notion of humility is accepting it right away. So what are your strategies and tips on how to get the buy-in from them? That's and I see you're shaking heads because I can't imagine, I get it, and people probably on the call get exactly what you're talking about, but there's definitely leaders who don't understand it. So I wanted to pick your brain a little bit to see what you would suggest.
Yeah, Evie, great question. You see, we are struggling to come up with an easy, clear answer. And I mean, Richard told me a very good lessons about the temptation of success and how difficult it is afterwards to accept non-success in a company without getting over the red line. So you have a lot of successful leaders. If you look at KPIs, how they use their budget, revenue, profit, who have not had the pressure to go into this because they just made their career in companies, and no one asked them, how do you achieve this, until it becomes a problem, a burnout, a company scandal, whatsoever. I believe you need in the company, and this is also why I think Tobias invited us and what the book is about, you have to train this in companies. You have to make this not one, workshop. There has to be a willingness in companies to stay super on high performance and profitable, but to do it in a different way, to discuss culture, to discuss dilemmas, to discuss vulnerability. If you start to create this atmosphere, leadership will change. Leaders will say, that's not the way I want to go. I will leave. I don't want to go into these discussions. You will get new talents in. I think there needs to be a movement, train the muscle, as Tobias said in this book, of culture to do this. I think the context of good leadership is super relevant. To be a good leader in a difficult context, or a bad context, super difficult. So you have to create the context, and that, I mean, there's a responsibility for leadership to create a good context. That's the responsibility of the board, of the executive, the C-suite. But without the context and this is really supported, it's tough. I don't know, Richard, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree.
I think Klaus is absolutely right. This is a trained skill set, because the DNA that brings someone up through a leadership position in a company is not necessarily humility, right? So I think part of this is being intentional about it. And Tobias and I share a common friend, Ron Carucci, and we did some research on why high performers are subject to ethical risk. And one of the solutions that we introduced based on our research is, why not have your leadership define failure, right? Okay, if this is what happens, and if you don't achieve your commercial objectives, this is what you can expect from us. You can expect that we'll try to have a get well plan. We're going to try to understand what factors were involved so that we can improve in the future. So normalizing failure, I think, is an exercise in humility, but I don't think leaders will naturally try to define failure. And also for leadership, and this is really going to be difficult, is to normalize the fact that markets are an S-curve, not linear. And, to say to someone who might be your high performer, we're acknowledging wonderful performance. We're also acknowledging that you did it the right way, but we also appreciate that these markets don't go up forever. So let's have a realistic conversation about what we might expect in the next quarter or the next year, so that we're not putting too much pressure or too much undue pressure on you to make results, to make up for other parts of the company. So these are conversations in humility that I think we need to, as you share in the book and as Klaus referenced, this is a muscle we need to build.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Evie.
Yeah, and Klaus and Richard, I wanted to really take the time to thank you both so much, and we're soon running out of time here. So, but thank you so much for sharing with us today, for sharing your experience, for taking this time, and I wanted to show, this is from You Can Culture. This is month 1, so connected to embracing vulnerability. These are reflection questions and actions that I encourage readers to think about. And the first is, what is your gut reaction when people raise concerns or issues regarding your leadership or the culture within your team and organization? Reflecting on past experiences, where have you struggled to acknowledge real issues? And are there areas where you might be hesitant or unwilling to acknowledge current concerns? It's challenging questions. And then I also ask people to act on committing to a regular ritual, to do what you shared that you do, Richard, to intentionally reflect on the values on a regular basis and consider the challenges and so on that you see. And Klaus, you wrote a beautiful endorsement of You Can Culture, where you said that this book is not a coffee table book, but it's a book made for the workplace. And that's exactly because of, as Evie, as you were pointing out, these are difficult conversations. These are things that are not coming naturally to a lot of people, especially in the business world. And it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them, just means that's not what we've been taught. And that's why, and I know so many, why Richard and so many are doing their important work, but that's also why I wrote this book, to give that kind of practical, actionable book that people can use. So my encouragement to you would be, take this and have these conversations. Talk about how we are responding, reflect on these questions, and start having these conversations. And that in our work at Heart Management, that's what we do with organizations. And we really see the impact when you do that on a regular basis, and you start training yourself in having those conversations, and the change that it can really make from the top of the organization down to, or however you want to see the hierarchy, but across the organization. And with that, I'm giving it back to you, Andreas.
Yes, and we are going to land. And thank you so much, Richard and Klaus, for sharing today. Thank you so much. Very valuable. And before we wrap this up, I just want to ask you, Tobias, about the continued journey. Would you say something short about that? I'll give you 60 seconds.
Yeah, so the journey continues. And after this, they're going to be coming podcast, and you're going to get email about them, as well as we'll continue to have conversations with people on these topics. We have just a lot of amazing people that are going to be featured in those, and so that's going to be really exciting. And then in March, we're going to have the next event. It's going to be, again, a stellar panel. We don't have the names 100% clear yet, but we'll communicate them soon. And so don't miss that, and keep being a part of this. And please invite others as well, as we really hope that it can make a big impact in a lot of organizations.
Yes. And as I mentioned in the start, we're going to send out the follow-up email after today. It will probably be tomorrow, where you will receive access to a presentation highlighting key learnings on cultivating a thriving culture of integrity with practical examples from large multinational companies. We also talk about how we at Heart Management practically support companies in putting these habits into practice across the company to drive needed culture change. So please take the time and read that through. It will be attached in the email. And me and Tobias would also love to connect with you all on LinkedIn. So expect a connection request in the coming days from us. And finally, I just want to say that we at Heart Management are here to serve. And if there's any way that we can serve you in your role and your work, don't hesitate to contact us. And with that said, I want to thank all of you for participating today.